Hello and welcome to Joan Comrie's Feeding Tips. My name is Joan Comrie and today I'm going to give a shout out to Shannon because she asked this really great question. Do babies need to spoon feed, and are purees an unnecessary step? So I'm going to answer that question as a professional, as a speech pathologist with over 30 years of working exclusively with infants and children with feeding and swallowing disorders. First of all, there are a ton of literature back as far as I know into the 1920s that have studied the acquisition and the development of feeding milestones. And what they have told us is that feeding milestones are an orderly sequence of, and it's a developmental skill. And what that means is that you learn your skills in an orderly sequence, which means that you learn a skill, you stabilize it, and that enables safe and successful acquisition of the next level of skill, which is required for feeding milestones. So I'm basing my premise on the acquisition and the skills that you learn from a spoon feeding, which helps you become a better chewer. And let me tell you why I think spoon feeding is really important. First of all, spoon feeding trains what's called central tongue grooving, and we've talked about that as a really important tongue pattern for breastfeeding and for bottle feeding. And that's the cupping of the tongue that babies need to produce. And so when you're an infant and you're drinking milk, your tongue pattern needs to have that cupping, which helps stabilize the nipple, and it also needs to start developing a little bit of tongue tip and then medial tongue and a little bit of posterior tongue elevation, and it's in a little sequence. And what spoon feeding does is it allows that spoon to place deeper tactile input or touch on the middle of that tongue to create a good cup. And so why is the cup important? Well, the cupping of the tongue is really important for you to be able to collect whatever you just chewed on the middle of your tongue so that you can lift the tip of the tongue and then the middle of the tongue and then the back of the tongue to propel or move the food down in towards your pharynx. And so what purees do is it progressively strengthens that pattern because we know that thinner textures need less propulsion or less strength of the tongue to move it backwards. And from our studies of swallowing, we know that the thicker the puree or the thicker the texture that you need to swallow, the more strength that you need to have on your tongue. And so if you think about it, everything you eat turns into a puree before you swallow it. Whether you're talking about a steak, a bagel, any kind of fruit or vegetable, all of those foods get pulverized or pureed and then placed on the middle of that tongue, and then you need the tip of that tongue to lift up, bring the middle up, and then the back up. If you stay in this sort of front-back, sort of immature suckle pattern that infants have, then you're going to have difficulty transporting healthy, complex foods, which are your fruits, your vegetables, and your proteins. It's very easy, and the junk food people have spent a lot of time making sure that processed food is really easy to eat. And those are forgiving foods, and kids that don't have good tongue tip elevation, and then it's called lingual propulsion, which just basically means the ability of the tongue to move the food back to go into the pharynx. And when kids don't have good patterns, then they tend to stick to the foods that's really easy to eat, which tends to be your junk food. Another benefit of spoon feeding is that in addition for training your tongue to transit more thicker or heavier foods, which is what happens when you chew your food, like we said, it turns into that puree, but also it trains top lip movement to clean the spoon. And that pattern of behavior is where you get your mamas. So when I'm in therapy and I'm working with a baby, a couple things happen when I'm doing spoon feeding training. Number one, speech sounds come in because the mouth becomes more active, the tongue becomes more active, and they start changing from open vowel sounds like ah to to dada, and then as we get to active top lip movements, we get mama. And the babies start babbling and start increasing their sound production with spoon feeding training in therapy. So to answer your question, Shannon and everyone else, do babies need to spoon feed, and is it a necessary step? And I would say yes to both of those. I don't think you need to spend a long time on spoon feeding. That's not what I'm saying. And of course, every child is different and every child has an individual need. So for what works with one baby may not work with another. So you may have a child that doesn't need to spoon feed, but I would say the general population, it is an advantage to train strength training on the spoon to get better active tongue patterns, to be able to transit your more complex healthy foods that we want, the table foods that we want our children to eat. And if you think about it, your spoon feeding is developing your core. So that is a core pattern of behavior that's vital for good transport of healthy foods. And if you don't have a strong core, just like if you don't have a good strong core in your body, you're not going to be a great walker. If you don't have good core of your tongue patterns, which the spoon feeding can produce for you, then you may not have good tongue patterns to transport, collect, and transport, and even chew, transport, and collect the more healthy foods that everybody wants their children to eat. I hope that clarifies a little bit. I'm going to have another video on baby-led weaning because I have a feeling that's where the question about purees come from, and I will give you my input or my recommendation as a speech pathologist, so I'm looking more from a medical point of view. If this was helpful, please share this video with anyone that you think it may be helpful, and please continue with comments because I would love to address those as soon as I can. Thanks and have a great day.